Section 39 of Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2 by Isaac Disraeli. Licensers of the Press. In the history of literature, and perhaps in that of the human mind, the institution of the licensers of the press and censors of books was a bold invention, designed to counteract that of the press itself, and even to convert this newly discovered instrument of human freedom into one which might serve to perpetuate that system of passive obedience which had so long enabled modern Rome to dictate her laws to the universe. It was thought possible in the subtlety of Italian astutia and Spanish monachism to place a sentinel on the very thoughts as well as on the persons of authors, and in extreme cases that books might be condemned to the flames as well as heretics. Of this institution the beginnings are obscure, for it originated in caution and fear, but as the work betrays the workman, and the national physiognomy the native, it is evident that so inquisitorial an act could only have originated in the Inquisition itself. Feeble or partial attempts might previously have existed, for we learn that the monks had a part of their libraries called the Inferno, which was not the part which they least visited, for it contained or hid all the prohibited books which they could smuggle into it. But this inquisitorial power assumed its most formidable shape in the Council of Trent, when some gloomy spirits from Rome and Madrid foresaw the revolution of this new age of books. The triple-crowned pontiff had in vain rolled the thunders of the Vatican to strike out of the hands of all men the volumes of Wycliffe, of Huss, and of Luther, and even menaced their eager readers with death. At this council, Pius IV was presented with a catalogue of books of which they denounced that the perusal ought to be forbidden. His bull not only confirmed this list of the condemned, but added rules how books should be judged. Subsequent popes enlarged these catalogues and added to the rules as the monstrous novelties started up. Inquisitors of books were appointed. At Rome they consisted of certain cardinals and the master of the Holy Palace, and literary inquisitors were elected at Madrid, at Lisbon, at Naples, and for the Low Countries. They were watching the ubiquity of the human mind. These catalogues of prohibited books were called indexes, and at Rome a body of these literary despots are still called the Congregation of the Index. The simple index is a list of condemned books which are never to be opened. But the expurgatory index indicates those only prohibited till they have undergone a purification. No book was allowed to be on any subject or in any language which contained a single position, an ambiguous sentence, even a word which in the most distant sense could be construed opposite to the doctrines of the supreme authority of this Council of Trent, where it seems to have been enacted that all men, literate and illiterate, prince and peasant, the Italian, the Spaniard, and the Netherlander, should take the mint stamp of their thoughts from the Council of Trent, and millions of souls be struck off at one blow out of the same used mould. The sages who compiled these indexes indeed long had reason to imagine that passive obedience was attached to the human character, and therefore they considered that the publications of their adversaries required no other notice than a convenient insertion in their indexes. But the heretics diligently reprinted them with ample prefaces and useful annotations. Dr. James of Oxford republished an index with due animadversions. The parties made an opposite use of them. While the Catholic crossed himself at every title, the heretic would purchase no book which had not been indexed. One of their portions exposed a list of those authors whose heads were condemned, as well as their books. It was a catalogue of men of genius. The results of these indexes were somewhat curious. As they were formed in different countries, the opinions were often diametrically opposite to each other. The learned Arius Montanus, who was a chief inquisitor in the Netherlands and concerned in the Antwerp Index, lived to see his own works placed in the Roman Index, while the Inquisitor of Naples was so displeased with the Spanish Index that he persisted to assert that it had never been printed at Madrid. Men who began by insisting that all the world should not differ from their opinions ended by not agreeing with themselves. A civil war raged among the index makers, and if one criminated, the other retaliated. If one discovered 10 places necessary to be expurgated, another found 30, and a third inclined to place the whole work in the condemned list. The inquisitors at length became so doubtful of their own opinions that they sometimes expressed in their licence for printing that they tolerated the reading after the book had been corrected by themselves, till such time as the work should be considered worthy of some farther correction. The expurgatory indexes excited louder complaints than those which simply condemned books, because the purgers and castrators, as they were termed, or as Milton calls them, the executioners of books, by omitting or interpolating passages, made an author say or unsay what the inquisitors chose, and their editions after the death of the authors were compared to the erasures or forgeries in records, for the books which an author leaves behind him with his last corrections are like his last will and testament, and the public are the legitimate heirs of an author's opinions. The whole process of these expurgatory indexes, that rakes through the entrails of many an old good author with a violation worse than any could be offered to his tomb, as Milton says, must inevitably draw off the life blood, and leave an author a mere spectre. A book in Spain and Portugal passes through 6 or 7 courts before it can be published, and is supposed to recommend itself by the information that it is published with all the necessary privileges. They would sometimes keep works from publication till they had properly qualified them inter remsi qualificam, which in one case is said to have occupied them during 40 years. Authors of genius have taken fright at the grip of the master of the Holy Palace, or the lacerating scratches of the corrector general por su majestad. At Madrid and Lisbon, and even at Rome, this licensing of books has confined most of their authors to the body of the good fathers themselves. The commentaries on the Lusiad by Faria de Souza had occupied his zealous labours for 25 years, and were favourably received by the learned. But the commentator was brought before this tribunal of criticism and religion, as suspected of heretical opinions. When the accuser did not succeed before the inquisitors of Madrid, he carried the charge to that of Lisbon. An injunction was immediately issued to forbid the sale of the commentaries, and it cost the commentator an elaborate defence to demonstrate the Catholicism of the poet and himself. The commentaries finally were released from perpetual imprisonment. This system has prospered to admiration, in keeping public opinion down to a certain meanness of spirit, and happily preserved stationary the childish stupidity through the nation, on which so much depended. Nani's History of Venice is allowed to be printed because it contained nothing against princes. Princes then were either immaculate or historians false. The history of Guicciardini is still scarred with the merciless wound of the papistic censor, and a curious account of the origin and increase of papal power was long wanting in the third and fourth book of his history. Vallet's History of France would have been an admirable work had it not been printed at Paris. When the insertions in the index were found of no other use than to bring the peccant volumes under the eyes of the curious, they employed the secular arm in burning them in public places. The history of these literary conflagrations has often been traced by writers of opposite parties, for the truth is that both use them. Zealots seem all formed of one material, whatever be their party. They had yet to learn that burning was not confuting, and that these public fires were an advertisement by proclamation. The publisher of Erasmus's Colloquies intrigued to procure the burning of his book, which raised the sale to 24,000. A curious literary anecdote has reached us of the times of Henry VIII. Tonstal, Bishop of London, accused at that day for his moderation in preferring the burning of books to that of authors, which was then getting into practice, to testify his abhorrence of Tyndale's Principles, who had printed a translation of the New Testament, a sealed book, for the multitude, thought of purchasing all the copies of Tyndale's translation and annihilating them in the common flame. This occurred to him when passing through Antwerp in 1529, then a place of refuge for the Tyndalists. He employed an English merchant there for this business, who happened to be a secret follower of Tyndale, and acquainted him with the bishop's intention. Tyndale was extremely glad to hear of the project, for he was desirous of printing a more correct edition of his version. The first impressions still hung on his hands, and he was too poor to make a new one. He gladly furnished the English merchant with all his unsold copies, which the bishop as eagerly bought, and had them all publicly burnt in Cheapside. The people not only declared this was a burning of the word of God, but it inflamed the desire of reading that volume, and the second edition was sought after at any price. When one of the Tyndalists, who was sent here to sell them, was promised by the Lord Chancellor in a private examination that he should not suffer if he would reveal who encouraged and supported his party at Antwerp, the Tyndalist immediately accepted the offer, and assured the Lord Chancellor that the greatest encouragement they had was from Tonstal, the Bishop of London, who had bought up half the impression, and enabled them to produce a second. In the reign of Henry VIII. We seem to have burnt books on both sides. It was an age of unsettled opinions. In Edward's, the Catholic works were burnt, and Mary had her pyramids of Protestant volumes. In Elizabeth's, political pamphlets fed the flames, and libels in the reign of James I. and his sons. Such was this black dwarf of literature, generated by Italian craft and Spanish monkery, which, however, was fondly adopted as it crept in among all the nations of Europe. France cannot exactly fix on the era of her censure de livres, and we ourselves, who gave it its death blow, found the custom prevail without any authority from our statutes. The practice of licensing books was unquestionably derived from the Inquisition, and was applied here first to books of religion. Britain long groaned under the leaden stamp of an imprimatur. Oxford and Cambridge still grasp at this shadow of departed literary despotism. They have their licensers and their imprimaturs. Long, even in our land, men of genius were either suffering the vigorous limbs of their productions to be shamefully mutilated in public, or voluntarily committed a literary suicide in their own manuscripts. Camden declared that he was not suffered to print all his Elizabeth, and sent those passages over to de Thou, the French historian, who printed his history faithfully 2 years after Camden's first edition, 1615. The same happened to Lord Herbert's History of Henry VIII., which has never been given according to the original, which is still in existence. In the poems of Lord Brooke we find a lacuna of the first 20 pages. It was a poem on religion, cancelled by the order of Archbishop Laud. The great Sir Matthew Hale ordered that none of his works should be printed after his death, as he apprehended that in the licensing of them some things might be struck out or altered which he had observed, not without some indignation, had been done to those of a learned friend, and he preferred bequeathing his uncorrupted manuscripts to the Society of Lincoln's Inn as their only guardians, hoping that they were a treasure worth keeping. Contemporary authors have frequent allusions to such books, imperfect and mutilated at the caprice or the violence of a licenser. The laws of England have never violated the freedom and the dignity of its press. There is no law to prevent the printing of any book in England, only a decree in the Star Chamber, said the learned Selden. Proclamations were occasionally issued against authors and books, and foreign works were at times prohibited. The freedom of the press was rather circumvented than openly attacked in the reign of Elizabeth, who dreaded the Roman Catholics, who were at once disputing her right to the throne and the religion of the state. Foreign publications, or books from any parts beyond the seas, were therefore prohibited. Footnote. The consequence of this prohibition was, that our own men of learning were at a loss to know what arms the enemies of England and of her religion were fabricating against us. This knowledge was absolutely necessary, as appears by a curious fact in Strype's Life of Whitgift. A license for the importation of foreign books was granted to an Italian merchant, with orders to collect abroad this sort of libels, but he was to deposit them with the Archbishop and the Privy Council. A few, no doubt, were obtained by the curious, Catholic or Protestant. Strype's Life of Whitgift, page 268. End of footnote. The press, however, was not free under the reign of a sovereign whose high-toned feelings and exigencies of the times rendered as despotic in deeds as the pacific James was in words. Although the press had then no restrictions, an author was always at the mercy of the government. Elizabeth, too, had a keen scent after what she called treason, which she allowed to take in a large compass. She condemned one author, with his publisher, to have the hand cut off which wrote his book, and she hanged another. Footnote. The author, with his publisher, who had their right hands cut off, was John Stubbs of Lincoln's Inn, a hot-headed Puritan, whose sister was married to Thomas Cartwright, the head of that faction. This execution took place upon a scaffold in the market-place at Westminster. After Stubbs had his right hand cut off, with his left he pulled off his hat, and cried with a loud voice, "God save the Queen!" The multitude, standing deeply silent, either out of horror at this new and unwonted kind of punishment, or else out of commiseration of the undaunted man, whose character was unblemished. Camden, a witness to this transaction, has related it. The author and the printer and the publisher were condemned to this barbarous punishment, on an act of Philip and Mary, against the authors and publishers of seditious writings. Some lawyers were honest enough to assert that the sentence was erroneous, for that act was only a temporary one, and died with Queen Mary. But of these honest lawyers, one was sent to the Tower, and another was so sharply reprimanded that he resigned his place as a judge in the Common Pleas. Other lawyers, as the Lord Chief Justice, who fawned on the prerogative far more then than afterwards in the Stuart reigns, asserted that Queen Mary was a king, and that an act made by any king, unless repealed, must always exist, because the King of England never dies. End of footnote. It was Sir Francis Bacon, or his father, who once pleasantly turned aside the keen edge of her regal vindictiveness; for when Elizabeth was inquiring whether an author whose book she had given him to examine was not guilty of treason, he replied, "Not of treason, madam, but of robbery, if you please; for he has taken all that is worth noticing in him from Tacitus and Sallust." With the fear of Elizabeth before his eyes, Holinshed castrated the volumes of his history. When Giles Fletcher, after his Russian embassy, congratulated himself with having escaped with his head, and on his return wrote a book called The Russian Commonwealth, describing its tyranny, Elizabeth forbade the publishing of the work. Our Russian merchants were frightened, for they petitioned the queen to suppress the work. The original petition, with the offensive passages, exists among the Lansdowne manuscripts. It is curious to contrast this fact with another better known under the reign of William III. Then the press had obtained its perfect freedom, and even the shadow of the sovereign could not pass between an author and his work. When the Danish ambassador complained to the king of the freedom which Lord Molesworth had exercised on his master's government, in his account of Denmark, and hinted that if a Dane had done the same with a king of England, he would on complaint have taken the author's head off. "That I cannot do," replied the sovereign of a free people; "but if you please, I will tell him what you say, and he shall put it into the next edition of his book." What an immense interval between the feelings of Elizabeth and William, with hardly a century betwixt them! James I. proclaimed Buchanan's History and a political tract of his at the Mercat Cross, and every one was to bring his copy to be perused and purged of the offensive and extraordinaire materis, under a heavy penalty. Knox, whom Milton calls the reformer of a kingdom, was also curtailed, and the sense of that great man shall to all posterity be lost for the fearfulness or the presumptuous rashness of a perfunctory licenser. The regular establishment of licensers of the press appeared under Charles the First. It must be placed among the projects of Laud, and the king, I suspect, inclined to it; for by a passage in a manuscript letter of the times, I find that when Charles printed his speech on the dissolution of the Parliament, which excited such general discontent, some one printed Queen Elizabeth's last speech as a companion piece. This was presented to the king by his own printer, John Bill, not from a political motive, but merely by way of complaint that another had printed, without leave or license, that which, as the king's printer, he asserted was his own copyright. Charles does not seem to have been pleased with the gift, and observed, "You printers print anything." "Three gentlemen of the bedchamber," continues the writer, standing by, "commended Mr. Bill very much, and prayed him to come oftener with such rarities to the king, because they might do some good." One of the consequences of this persecution of the press was the raising up of a new class of publishers under the government of Charles the First, those who became noted for what was then called unlawful and unlicensed books. Sparks, the publisher of Prynne's Histriomastics, was of this class. I have elsewhere entered more particularly into this subject. The Presbyterian party in Parliament, who thus found the press closed on them, vehemently cried out for its freedom, and it was imagined that when they had ascended into power, the odious office of a licenser of the press would have been abolished. But these pretended friends of freedom, on the contrary, discovered themselves as tenderly alive to the office as the old government, and maintained it with the extremest vigor. Such is the political history of mankind. The literary fate of Milton was remarkable. His genius was castrated alike by the monarchical and the republican government. The royal licenser expunged several passages from Milton's history, in which Milton had painted the superstition, the pride, and the cunning of the Saxon monks, which the sagacious licenser applied to Charles II. And the bishops. But Milton had before suffered as merciless a mutilation from his old friends the republicans, who suppressed a bold picture taken from life which he had introduced into his history of the Long Parliament and Assembly of Divines. Milton gave the unlicensed passages to the Earl of Anglesey, a literary nobleman, the editor of Whitelocke's Memorials, and the castrated passage, which could not be licensed in 1670, was received with peculiar interest when separately published in 1681. Footnote: it is a quarto tract entitled Mr. John Milton's Character of the Long Parliament and Assembly of Divines in 1641, omitted in his other works, and never before printed, and very seasonable for these times, 1681. It is inserted in the uncastrated edition of Milton's prose works in 1738. It is a retort on the Presbyterian Clement Walker's History of the Independents, and Warburton, in his admirable characters of the historians of this period, alluding to Clement Walker, says, Milton was even with him in the fine and severe character he draws of the Presbyterian administration. End of footnote. If there be found in an author's book one sentence of a venturous edge, uttered in the height of zeal, and who knows whether it might not be the dictate of a divine spirit, yet not suiting every low decrepit humour of their own, they will not pardon him their dash. This office seems to have lain dormant a short time under Cromwell, from the scruples of a conscientious licenser who desired the Council of State in 1649, for reasons given, to be discharged from that employment. This Mabot, the licenser, was evidently deeply touched by Milton's address for the liberty of unlicensed printing. The office was, however, revived on the restoration of Charles II, and through the reign of James II. The abuses of licensers were unquestionably not discouraged. Their castrations of books reprinted appear to have been very artful, for in reprinting Gage's Survey of the West Indies, which originally consisted of 22 chapters in 1648 and 1657, with a dedication to Sir Thomas Fairfax in 1677, after expunging the passages in honour of Fairfax, the dedication is dexterously turned into a preface, and the 22nd chapter, being obnoxious for containing particulars of the artifices of the Papelins, as Milton calls the Papists, in converting the author, was entirely chopped away by the licenser's hatchet. The castrated chapter, as usual, was preserved afterwards separately. Literary despotism, at least, is short-sighted in its views, for the expedients it employs are certain of overturning themselves. On this subject we must not omit noticing one of the noblest and most eloquent prose compositions of Milton, the Areopagitica, a speech for the liberty of unlicensed printing. It is a work of love and inspiration, and breathing the most enlarged spirit of literature, separating at an awful distance from the multitude that character who was born to study and to love learning for itself, not for lucre or any other end, but perhaps for that lasting fame and perpetuity of praise, which God and good men have consented shall be the reward of those whose published labours advance the good of mankind. One part of this unparalleled effusion turns on the quality which ought to be in every licenser. It will suit our new licensers of public opinion, a laborious corps well known, who constitute themselves without an act of Star Chamber. I shall pick out but a few sentences, that I may add some little facts, casually preserved, of the ineptitude of such an officer. He who is made judge to sit upon the birth or death of books, whether they may be wafted into this world or not, had need to be a man above the common measure. both studious, learned, and judicious, there may be else no mean mistakes in his censure. If he be of such worth as behooves him, there cannot be a more tedious and unpleasing journey work, a greater loss of time levied upon his head, than to be made the perpetual reader of unchosen books and pamphlets. There is no book acceptable unless at certain seasons, but to be enjoined the reading of that at all times, whereof 3 pages would not down at any time, is an imposition which I cannot believe how he that values time in his own studies, or is but of a sensible nostril, should be able to endure. What advantage is it to be a man over it is to be a boy at school? If we have only 'scaped the ferula to come under the fescue of an imprimatur. If serious and elaborate writings, as if they were no more than the theme of a grammar lad under his pedagogue, must not be uttered without the cursory eyes of a temporizing licenser. When a man writes to the world, he summons up all his reason and deliberation to assist him. He searches, meditates, is industrious, and likely consults and confers with his judicious friends, as well as any that writ before him. If in this, the most consummate act of his fidelity and ripeness, no years, no industry, no former proof of his abilities can bring him to that state of maturity as not to be still mistrusted and suspected, unless he carry all his considerate diligence, all his midnight watchings and expensive Palladian oil to the hasty view of an unleisured licenser, perhaps much his younger, perhaps inferior in judgment, perhaps one who never knew the labour of book writing, and if he be not repulsed or slighted, must appear in print like a puny, with his guardian and his censor's hand on the back of his title to be his bail and surety that he is no idiot or seducer. It cannot be but a dishonour and derogation to the author, to the book, to the privilege and dignity of learning. The reader may now follow the stream in the great original. I must, however, preserve one image of exquisite sarcasm. Debtors and delinquents walk about without a keeper, but inoffensive books must not stir forth without a visible jailor in their title, nor is it to the common people less than a reproach. For if we dare not trust them with an English pamphlet, what do we but censure them for a giddy, vicious, and ungrounded people, in such a sick and weak state of faith and discretion, as to be able to take nothing but through the glister pipe of a licenser? The ignorance and stupidity of these censors were often indeed as remarkable as their exterminating spirit. The noble simile of Milton of Satan with the rising sun, in the first book of the Paradise Lost, had nearly occasioned the suppression of our national epic. It was supposed to contain a treasonable allusion. The tragedy of Arminius, by one Paterson, who was an amanuensis of the poet Thomson, was intended for representation, but the dramatic censor refused a license. As Edward and Eleonora was not permitted to be performed, being considered a party work, our sagacious state critic imagined that Paterson's own play was in the same predicament by being in the same handwriting. Malebranche said that he could never obtain an approbation for his research after truth, because it was unintelligible to his censors. At length Mézeray, the historian, approved of it as a book of geometry. Latterly, in France, it is said that the greatest geniuses were obliged to submit their works to the critical understanding of persons who had formerly been low dependents on some man of quality, and who appear to have brought the same servility of mind to the examination of works of genius. There is something which, on the principle of incongruity and contrast, becomes exquisitely ludicrous in observing the works of men of genius allowed to be printed and even commended by certain persons who have never printed their names but to their licenses. One of these gentlemen suppressed a work because it contained principles of government which appeared to him not conformable to the laws of Moses. Another said to a geometrician, "I cannot permit the publication of your book. You dare to say that between two given points the shortest line is the straight line. Do you think me such an idiot as not to perceive your allusion? If your work appeared, I should make enemies of all those who find by crooked ways an easier admittance into court than by a straight line. Consider their number." This seems, however, to be an excellent joke. At this moment the censors in Austria appear singularly inept, for not long ago they condemned as heretical 2 books, one of which, entitled Principe de la Trigonométrie, the censor would not allow to be printed because the Trinity, which he imagined to be included in trigonometry, was not permitted to be discussed; and the other, on the destruction of insects, he insisted had a covert allusion to the Jesuits, who, he conceived, were thus malignantly designated. A curious literary anecdote has been recorded of the learned Richard Simon, compelled to insert in one of his works the qualifying opinions of the censor of the Sorbonne. He inserted them within crotchets, but a strange misfortune attended this contrivance. The printer, who was not let into the secret, printed the work without these essential marks, by which means the enraged author saw his own peculiar opinions overturned in the very work written to maintain them. These appear trifling minutiae, and yet, like a hair in a watch, which utterly destroys its progress, these little ineptiae obliged writers to have recourse to foreign presses, compelled a Montesquieu to write with concealed ambiguity, and many to sign a recantation of principles which they could never change. The recantation of Selden, extorted from his hand on his suppressed history of tithes, humiliated a great mind, but it could not remove a particle from the masses of his learning, nor darken the luminous conviction of his reasonings, nor did it diminish the number of those who assented and now assent to his principles. Recantations usually prove the force of authority rather than the change of opinion. When a Dr. Pocklington was condemned to make a recantation, he hit the etymology of the word, while he caught at the spirit. He began thus: "If canto be to sing, recanto is to sing again," so that he rechanted his offending opinions by repeating them in his recantation. At the Revolution in England, licenses for the press ceased, but its liberty did not commence till 1694, when every restraint was taken off by the firm and decisive tone of the Commons. It was granted, says our philosophic Hume, to the great displeasure of the king and his ministers, who, seeing nowhere in any government during present or past ages any example of such unlimited freedom, doubted much of its salutary effects, and probably thought that no books or writings would ever so much improve the general understanding of men as to render it safe to entrust them with an indulgence so easily abused. And the present moment verifies the prescient conjecture of the philosopher. Such is the licentiousness of our press, that some, not perhaps the most hostile to the cause of freedom, would not be averse to manacle authors once more with an imprimatur. It will not be denied that Erasmus was a friend to the freedom of the press, yet he was so shocked at the licentiousness of Luther's pen that there was a time when he considered it necessary to restrain its liberty. It was then as now. Erasmus had indeed been miserably calumniated, and expected future libels. I am glad, however, to observe that he afterwards, on a more impartial investigation, confessed that such a remedy was much more dangerous than the disease. To restrain the liberty of the press can only be the interest of the individual, never that of the public. One must be a patriot here. We must stand in the field with an unshielded breast, since the safety of the people is the supreme law. There were, in Milton's days, some who said of this institution that, although the inventors were bad, the thing, for all that, might be good. This may be so, replies the vehement advocate for unlicensed printing; but as the commonwealths have existed through all ages and have forborne to use it, he sees no necessity for the invention, and held it as a dangerous and suspicious fruit from the tree which bore it. The ages of the wisest commonwealths, Milton seems not to have recollected, were not diseased with the popular infection of publications, issuing at all hours, and propagated with a celerity on which the ancients could not calculate. The learned Dr. James, who has denounced the invention of the indexes, confesses, however, that it was not unuseful when it restrained the publications of atheistic and immoral works. But it is our lot to bear with all the consequent evils, that we may preserve the good inviolate, since, as the profound Hume has declared, the liberty of Britain is gone for ever when such attempts shall succeed. A constitutional sovereign will consider the freedom of the press as the sole organ of the feelings of the people. Calumniators he will leave to the fate of calumny, a fate similar to those who, having overcharged their arms with the fellest intentions, find that the death which they intended for others in bursting only annihilates themselves. End of section 39. Section 40 of Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2, by Isaac Disraeli, of Anagrams and Echo Verses. The true modern critics on our elder writers are apt to thunder their anathemas on innocent heads. Little versed in the eras of our literature and the fashions of our wit, popular criticism must submit to be guided by the literary historian. Kippis condemns Sir Symonds D'Ewes for his admiration of two anagrams, expressive of the feelings of the times. It required the valour of Falstaff to attack extinct anagrams, and our pretended English Bayle thought himself secure in pronouncing all anagrammatists to be wanting in judgment and taste. Yet if this mechanical critic did not know something of the state and nature of anagrams in Sir Symonds' day, he was more deficient in that curiosity of literature which his work required, than plain honest Sir Symonds, in the taste and judgment of which he is so contemptuously deprived. The author who thus decides on the tastes of another age by those of his own day, and whose knowledge of the national literature does not extend beyond his own century, is neither historian nor critic. The truth is, that anagrams were then the fashionable amusements of the wittiest and the most learned. Kippis says, and others have repeated, that Sir Symonds D'Ewes's judgment and taste with regard to wit were as contemptible as can well be imagined, will be evident from the following passage taken from his account of Carr, Earl of Somerset, and his wife. This discontent gave many satirical wits occasion to vent themselves into stinging libels, in which they spared neither the persons nor families of that unfortunate pair. There came also two anagrams to my hands, not unworthy to be owned by the rarest wits of this age. These were, one very descriptive of the lady, and the other of an incident in which this infamous woman was so deeply criminated. Francis Howard, Carr finds a whore. Thomas Overbury, base murther. This sort of wit is not falser, at least, than the criticism which infers that D'Ewes's judgment and taste were as contemptible as can well be; for he might have admired these anagrams, which, however, are not of the nicest construction, and yet not have been so destitute of those qualities of which he is so authoritatively divested. Camden has a chapter in his Remains on anagrams, which he defines to be a dissolution of a person's name into its letters as its elements, and a new connection into words is formed by their transposition, if possible, without addition, subtraction, or change of the letters, and the words must make a sentence applicable to the person named. The anagram is complimentary or satirical. It may contain some allusion to an event, or describe some personal characteristic. Footnote: Southey, in his Doctor, has a whimsical chapter on anagrams, which he says are not likely ever again to hold so high a place among the prevalent pursuits of literature as they did in the 17th century, when Louis XIII. Appointed the Provençal Thomas Belon to be his royal anagrammatist, and granted him a salary of 12,000 livres. End of footnote. Such difficult trifles it may be convenient at all times to discard; but if ingenious minds can convert an anagram into a means of exercising their ingenuity, the things themselves will necessarily become ingenious. No ingenuity can make an acrostic ingenious, for this is nothing but a mechanical arrangement of the letters of a name, and yet this literary folly long prevailed in Europe. As for anagrams, if antiquity can consecrate some follies, they are of very ancient date. They were classed among the Hebrews, among the Kabbalistic sciences. They pretended to discover occult qualities in proper names. It was an oriental practice, and was taught by the Greeks. Plato had strange notions of the influence of anagrams when drawn out of persons' names, and the later Platonists are full of the mysteries of the anagrammatic virtues of names. The chimerical associations of the character and qualities of a man with his name, anagrammatized, may often have instigated to the choice of a vocation, or otherwise affected his imagination. Lycophron has left some on record. 2 on Ptolemaeus Philadelphus, king of Egypt, and his queen Arsinoe. The king's name was thus anagrammatized: Ptolemaeus, Apo Melitos, made of honey, and the queen's Arsinoe, Hera's Ion, Juno's violet. Learning, which revived under Francis the First in France, did not disdain to cultivate this small flower of wit. Dorat had such a felicity in making these trifles, that many illustrious persons sent their names to him to be anagrammatized. Le Laboureur, the historian, was extremely pleased with the anagram made on the mistress of Charles the Ninth of France. Her name was Marie Touchet, Je charme tout, which is historically just. In the assassin of Henry III, Frère Jacques Roman, they discovered C'est l'enfer qui m'a créé. I preserve a few specimens of some of our own anagrams. The mildness of the government of Elizabeth, contrasted with her intrepidity against the Iberians, is thus picked out of her title. She is made the English ewe lamb, and the lioness of Spain. Elizabetha Virginia Anglii, Anglis Agna, Hiberii Leah. The unhappy history of Mary Queen of Scots, the deprivation of her kingdom, and her violent death, were expressed in this Latin anagram: Maria Stuarda Scotorum Regina, Trusa vi regnis morte amaracado. And in Maria Stewarta, Veritas armata. Another fanciful one on our James the First, whose rightful claim to the British monarchy as the descendant of the visionary Arthur could only have satisfied genealogists of romance reading. Charles James Stuart claims Arthur's seat. Sylvester, the translator of Du Bartas, considered himself fortunate when he found in the name of his sovereign the strongest bond of affection to his service. In the dedication he rings loyal changes on the name of his liege, James Stuart, in which he finds a just master. The anagram on Monk, afterwards Duke of Albemarle, on the restoration of Charles II., included an important date in our history. Georgius Monk, Dux de Aumarle, ego regem reduxi an sa, Roman numerals M, D, C, L, B, V. A slight reversing of the letters in a name produced a happy complement, as in Vernon was found renown, and the celebrated Sir Thomas Wyatt bore his own designation in his name, a wit. Two of the luckiest hits which anagrammatists have made were on the Attorney General William Noy, I moil in law, and Sir Edmundbury Godfrey, I find murdered by rogues. But of unfitting anagrams none were ever more curiously unfit than those which were discovered in Marguerite de Valois, the profligate Queen of Navarre, Salve vergo martyr Dei, ou de vertu royale image, Southey's Doctor. Of the poet Waller, the anagrammatist said, his brows need not with laurel to be bound, since in his name with laurel he is crowned. Randall Holmes, who has written a very extraordinary volume on heraldry, was complimented by an expressive anagram, Lo, Men's Herald. These anagrams were often devoted to the personal attachments of love or friendship. A friend delighted to twine his name with the name of his friend. Crashaw, the poet, had a literary intimate of the name of Carr, who was his posthumous editor, and in prefixing some elegiac lines discovers that his late friend Crashaw was Carr. For so the anagram of Crashaw runs, he was Carr. On this quaint discovery he has indulged all the tenderness of his recollections. Was Carr then Crashaw, or was Crashaw Carr? Since both within one name combined are. Yes, Carr's Crashaw, he Carr, 'tis love alone which melts two hearts of both composing one. So Crashaw's still the same, etc. A happy anagram on a person's name might have a moral effect on the feelings, as there is reason to believe that certain celebrated names have had some influence on the personal character. When one Martha Nicholson was found out to be soon calm in heart, the anagram, in becoming familiar to her, might afford an opportune admonition. But perhaps the happiest of anagrams was produced on a singular person and occasion. Lady Eleanor Davies, the wife of the celebrated Sir John Davies, the poet, was a very extraordinary character. She was the Cassandra of her age, and several of her predictions warranted her to conceive she was a prophetess. As her prophecies in the troubled times of Charles the First were usually against the government, she was at length brought by them into the court of high commission. The prophetess was not a little mad, and fancied the spirit of Daniel was in her, from an anagram she had formed of her name. Eleanor Davies, reveal, O Daniel. The anagram had too much by an L, and too little by an S, yet Daniel and reveal were in it, and that was sufficient to satisfy her inspirations. The court attempted to dispossess the spirit from the lady, while the bishops were in vain reasoning the point with her out of the Scriptures to no purpose, she poising text against text. One of the deans of the arches, says Heylin, shot her through and through with an arrow borrowed from her own quiver. He took a pen, and at last hit upon this elegant anagram: Dame Eleanor Davies, never so mad a lady. The happy fancy put the solemn court into laughter, and Cassandra into the utmost dejection of spirit. Foiled by her own weapons, her spirit suddenly forsook her, and either she never afterwards ventured on prophesying, or the anagram perpetually reminded her hearers of her state, and we hear no more of this prophetess. Thus much have I written in favour of Sir Symonds D'Ewes's keen relish of a stingy anagram, and on the error of those literary historians who do not enter into the spirit of the age they are writing on. We find in the Scribleriad the anagrams appearing in the land of false wit. But with still more disordered march, advance, nor march it seemed, but wild fantastic dance, the uncouth anagrams, distorted train, shifting in double mazes o'er the plain. Canto II, 161. The fine humour of Addison was never more playful than in his account of that anagrammatist, who, after shutting himself up for half a year, and having taken certain liberties with the name of his mistress, discovered, on presenting his anagram, that he had misspelt her surname, by which he was so thunderstruck with his misfortune, that in a little time after he lost his senses, which indeed had been very much impaired by that continual application he had given to his anagram. One Frenzelius, a German, prided himself on perpetuating the name of every person of eminence who died by an anagram; but by the description of the bodily pain he suffered on these occasions, when he shut himself up for those rash attempts, he seems to have shared in the dying pangs of the mortals whom he so painfully celebrated. Others appear to have practised this art with more facility. A French poet, deeply in love, in one day sent his mistress, whose name was Magdalene, 36 of anagrams on her single name. Even old Camden, who lived in the golden age of anagrams, notices the difficilia quae pulchra, the charming difficulty, as a whetstone of patience to them that shall practise it. For some have been seen to bite their pen, scratch their heads, bend their brows, bite their lips, beat the board, tear their paper, when their names were fair for somewhat, and caught nothing therein. Such was the troubled happiness of an anagrammatist. Yet, adds our venerable author, notwithstanding the sour sort of critics, good anagrams yield a delightful comfort and pleasant motion in honest minds. Footnote. Drummond of Hawthornden speaks of anagrams as most idle study. You may of one and the same name make both good and evil. So did my uncle find in Anna Regina Ingenare, as well of Anna Britannorum Regina, Anna Regnantium Arbor, as he who in Charles de Valois found Chasse la Duoloy, and after the massacre found Chasseur des Loyaux. Often they are most false, as Henri de Bourbon, Moneur de Biron. Of all the anagrammatists, and with least pain, he was the best who, out of his own name, being Jacques de la Chambre, found La Chambre de Jacques, and rested there. And next to him, here at home, a gentleman whose mistress's name being Anagram, he found it an anagram already. End of footnote. When the mania of making anagrams prevailed, the little persons at court flattered the great ones at inventing anagrams for them, and when the wit of the maker proved to be as barren as the letters of the name, they dropped or changed them, raving with the alphabet and racking their wits. Among the manuscripts of the grave Sir Julius Caesar, one cannot but smile at a bundle of emphatically endorsed trash. It is a collection of these court anagrams, a remarkable evidence of that ineptitude to which mere fashionable wit can carry the frivolous. In consigning this intellectual exercise to oblivion, we must not confound the miserable and the happy together. A man of genius would not consume an hour in extracting even a fortunate anagram from a name, although on an extraordinary person or occasion its apposite might be worth an epigram. Much of its merit will arise from the association of ideas. A trifler can only produce what is trifling, but an elegant mind may delight by some elegant allusion, and a satirical one by its causticity. We have some recent ones which will not easily be forgotten. A similar contrivance, that of echo verses, may here be noticed. I have given a specimen of these in a modern French writer, whose sportive pen has thrown out so much wit and humour in his echoes. Nothing ought to be contemned which, in the hands of a man of genius, is converted into a medium of his talents. No verses have been considered more contemptible than these, which, with all their kindred, have been anathematized by Butler in his exquisite character of a small poet in his Remains, whom he describes as tumbling through the hoop of an anagram, and all those gambols of wit. The philosophical critic will be more tolerant than was the orthodox church wit of that day, who was indeed alarmed at the fantastical heresies which were then prevailing. I say not a word in favour of unmeaning acrostics, but anagrams and echo verses may be shown capable of reflecting the ingenuity of their makers. I preserve a copy of echo verses which exhibit a curious picture of the state of our religious fanatics, the Roundheads of Charles I, as an evidence that in the hands of a wit even such things can be converted into the instruments of wit. At the end of a comedy presented at the entertainment of the Prince by the scholars of Trinity College, Cambridge, in March 1641, printed for James Calvin 1642, the author, Francis Cole, holds in a print a paper in one hand and a round hat in the other. At the end of all is this humorous little poem: The Echo. Now, echo, on what's religion grounded? Roundhead. Who's its professors most considerable? Rabble. How do these prove themselves to be the godly? Oddly. But they in life are known to be the holy. Oli. Who are these preachers, men or women common? Common. Come they from any university? City. Do they not learning from their doctrine sever? Ever. Yet they pretend that they do edify. O fie. What do you call it then? To fructify. Ay. What church have they? And what pulpits? Pits. But now in chambers the conventicle tickle. The godly sisters shrewdly are belied, bellied. The godly number then will soon transcend, end. As for the temples, they with zeal embrace them, race them. What do they make of Bishop's hierarchy? Archie, footnote. An allusion probably to Archibald Armstrong, the fool or privileged jester of Charles I, usually called Archie, who had a quarrel with Archbishop Laud, and of whom many arch things are on record. There is a little jest book, very high priced, and of little worth, which bears the title of Archie's Jests. End of footnote. Are crosses, images, ornaments their scandal? All, nor will they leave us many ceremonies, monies. Must even religion down for satisfaction? Faction. How stand they affected to the government civil? Evil. But to the king they say they are most loyal, lie all. Then God keep king and state from these same men. Amen. End of section 40.
Section 41 of Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2, by Isaac Disraeli. Orthography of proper names. We are often perplexed to decide how the names of some of our eminent men ought to be written, and we find that they are even now written diversely. The truth is that our orthography was so long unsettled among us that it appears by various documents of the times which I have seen that persons were at a loss how to write their own names, and most certainly have written them variously. I have sometimes suspected that estates may have been lost and descendants confounded by such uncertain and disagreeing signatures of the same person. In a late suit respecting the Duchess of Norfolk's estate, one of the ancestors has his name printed Higford, Higford, while in the genealogy it appears Hickford, Hickford. I think I have seen Ben Jonson's name written by himself with an H, and Dryden made use of an I. I have seen an injunction to printers with the sign manual of Charles II not to print Samuel Butler, Botler, Esquire's book or poem called Hudibras, without his consent, but I do not know whether Butler thus wrote his name. As late as in 1660, a Dr. Crown, Crovne, was at such a loss to have his name pronounced rightly that he tried 6 different ways of writing it, as appears by printed books. Cron, Croon, Crovn, Crone, Croone, and Crovne, all of which appear under his own hand, as he wrote it differently at different periods of his life. In the subscription book of the Royal Society he writes W. Croone, Croone, but in his will at the Commons he signs W. Crown, Crovne. Ray, Ray, the naturalist, informs us that he first wrote his name Wray, but afterwards omitted the W. Dr. Whitby, in books published by himself, writes his name sometimes Whiteby, Whiteby, and among the Harleian manuscripts there is a large collection of letters, to which I have often referred, written between 1620 and 1630 by Joseph Mead, Mead, and yet in all his printed letters and his works, even within that period, it is spelt Mede, by which signature we recognize the name of a learned man better known to us. It was long before I discovered the letter writer to have been this scholar. Oldys, in some curious manuscript memoirs of his family, has traced the family name through a great variety of changes, and sometimes it is at such variance that the person indicated will not always appear to have belonged to the family. We saw recently an advertisement in the newspapers offering £5,000 to prove a marriage in the family of the Nevets, which occurred about 1633. What most disconcerted the inquirers is their discovery that the family name was written in 6 or 7 different ways, a circumstance which I have no doubt will be found in most family names in England. Fuller mentions that the name of Villars was spelt 14 different ways in the deeds of that family. I shall illustrate this subject by the history of the names of 2 of our most illustrious countrymen, Shakespeare and Raleigh. We all remember the day when a violent literary controversy was opened, nor is it yet closed, respecting the spelling of our poet's name. One great editor persisted in his triumphant discovery by printing Shaksspere, while another would only partially yield Shakspeare, but all parties seemed willing to drop the usual and natural derivation of his name, in which we are surely warranted from a passage in a contemporary writer, who alludes by the name to a conceit of his own of the martial spirit of the poet. Footnote: the writer was Bancroft, who, in his 2 books of epigrams, 1639, has the following addressed to the poet: "Thou hast so used thy pen, or shook thy spear, that poets startle, nor thy wit come near." End of footnote. The truth seems to be, then, that personal names were written by the ear, since the persons themselves did not attend to the accurate writing of their own names, which they changed sometimes capriciously, and sometimes with anxious nicety. Our great poet's name appears Shakspeare, Shakspeare, in the register of Stratford Church. It is Shakspeare in the body of his will, but that very instrument is endorsed Mr. Shakspeare's Shakspeare will. He himself has written his name in 2 different ways, Shakspeare and Shakspere. Mr. Coleman says the poet's name in his own county is pronounced with the first A short, which accounts for this mode of writing the name, and proves that the orthography rather than the orthography of a person's name was most attended to, a very questionable and uncertain standard. Footnote: there can be little doubt now, after a due consideration of evidence, that the proper way of spelling our great dramatist's name is Shakespeare, in accordance with its signification, but there is good proof that the pronunciation of the first syllable was short and sharp, and that the Warwickshire patois gave it the sound of Shakespeare. In the earliest entries of the name in legal records, it is written Schakespere. The name of the great dramatist's father is entered in the Stratford Corporation books in 1665 as John Shakspeare, Shaksper. There are many varieties of spelling the name, but that is strictly in accordance with other instances of the looseness of spelling usual with writers of that era. As a general rule, the printed form of an author's name seldom varied, and may be accepted as the correct one. End of footnote. Another remarkable instance of this sort is the name of Sir Walter Raleigh, Rawley, which I am myself uncertain how to write, although I have discovered a fact which proves how it should be pronounced. Raleigh's name was spelt by himself and by his contemporaries in all sorts of ways. We find it Raleigh, Raleigh, Rawleigh, Raweley, and Rawly, the last of which at least preserves its pronunciation. This great man, when young, subscribed his name Walter Raleigh, Raweley, of the Middle Temple, to a copy of verses prefixed to a satire called The Steel Glass in George Gascoigne's works, 1576. Sir Walter was then a young student, and these verses, both by their spirit and signature, cannot fail to be his. However, this matter is doubtful, for the critics have not met elsewhere with his name thus written. The orthopy of the name of this great man I can establish by the following fact. When Sir Walter was first introduced to James I. on the king's arrival in England, with whom, being united with an opposition party, he was no favourite, the Scottish monarch gave him this broad reception: "Raleigh, Raleigh, true enough, for I think of thee very rawly, mon." There is also an enigma contained in a distich written by a lady of the times, which preserves the real pronunciation of the name of this extraordinary man. "What's bad for the stomach and the word of dishonour is the name of the man whom the king will not honour." Thus our ancient personal names were written down by the ear at a period when we had no settled orthography, and even at a later period, not distant from our own times, some persons, it might be shown, have been equally puzzled how to write their names. Witness the Thomsons, Thomson, Thompsons, Thompson, the Whartons, Warton, Whartons, Wharton, etc. End of section 41.
Section 42 of Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2, by Isaac Disraeli. Names of Our Streets. Lord Orford has in one of his letters projected a curious work to be written in a walk through the streets of the metropolis, similar to a French work entitled Anecdotes des rues de Paris. I know of no such work, and suspect the vivacious writer alluded in his mind to Sainte-Foix's Essai historique sur Paris, a very entertaining work, of which the plan is that projected by his lordship. We have had Pennant's London, a work of this description; but, on the whole, this is a superficial performance, as it regards manners, characters, and events. That antiquary skimmed everything, and grasped scarcely anything. He wanted the patience of research, and the keen spirit which revivifies the past. Should Lord Orford's project be carried into execution, or rather should Pennant be hereafter improved, it would be first necessary to obtain the original names or the meanings of our streets, free from the disguise in which time has concealed them. We shall otherwise lose many characters of persons and many remarkable events, of which their original denominations would remind the historian of our streets. I have noted down a few of these modern misnomers, that this future historian may be excited to discover more. Mincing Lane was Minchon Lane, from tenements pertaining to the Minchons, or nuns of St. Helens in Bishopsgate Street. Gutter Lane corrupted from Gutherin's Lane, from its first owner, a citizen of great trade. Blackwall Hall was Bakewell's Hall, from one Thomas Bakewell, and originally called Bassing's Hall, from a considerable family of that name, whose arms were once seen on the ancient building, and whose name is still perpetuated in Basing's Lane. Finch Lane was Finky's Lane, from a whole family of this name. Threadneedle Street was originally Thrid-needle Street, as Samuel Clarke dates it from his study there. Billiter Lane is a corruption of Belziter's Lane, from the first builder or owner. Cretched Friars was Crouched or Crossed Friars. Lothbury was so named from the noise of founders at their work, and, as Howell pretends, this place was called Lothbury, disdainedly. Garlic Hill was Garlic Hive, where garlic was sold. Fetter Lane has been erroneously supposed to have some connection with the fetters of criminals. It was in Charles I.'s time written Future Lane, and is so in Howell's Londinopolis, who explains it from futures, or idle people, lying there as in a way leading to gardens. It was the haunt of these faitors, or mighty beggars. The faitor, that is, a defater or defaulter, became future, and in the rapid pronunciation or conception of names, future has ended in Fetter Lane. Gracechurch Street, sometimes called Gracious Street, was originally Grass Street, from the herb market there. Fenchurch Street, from a fenny or moorish ground by a river side. Galley Quay has preserved its name, but its origin may have been lost. Howell, in his Londinopolis, says, "Here dwelt strangers called galleymen, who brought wines, etc., in galleys." Greek Street, says Pennant, I am sorry to degrade into Grig Street, whether it alludes to the little vivacious eel, or to the merry character of its tenants, he does not resolve. Bridewell was St. Bridget's Well, from one dedicated to St. Bride, or Bridget. Marybone was St. Mary on the Bourne, corrupted to Marybone, as Holborn was Old Bourne, or the Old River, Bourne being the ancient English for river, hence the Scottish burn. Newington was Newtown. Maiden Lane was so called from an image of the Virgin, which in Catholic days had stood there, as Bagford writes to Hearn, and he says that the frequent sign of the maiden head was derived from Our Lady's head. Lad Lane was originally Lady's Lane, from the same personage. Rood Lane was so denominated from a rood, or Jesus on the cross, there placed, which was held in great regard. Piccadilly was named after a hall called Piccadilly Hall, a place of sale for piccadillies or turnovers, a part of the fashionable dress which appeared about 1614. It has preserved its name uncorrupted, for Barnaby Rice, in his Honesty of the Age, has this passage on "the body makers that do swarm through all parts, both of London and about London. The body is still pampered up in the very dropsy of excess. He that some 40 years sithens should have asked after a Piccadilly, I wonder who would have understood him, or could have told what a Piccadilly had been, either fish or flesh." Footnote: the term seems to have been applied to the article from the pointed or peaked edges of the lace, which surrounded the stiff pleated ruffs, and may be constantly seen in portraits of the era of Elizabeth and James. Strype notices that in the Liberties of St. Catherine is a place called Hangman's Gains. The traders of Hames and Gines, in France, anciently resorted there. Thence the strange corruption. Smithfield is a corruption of Smoothfield. Smith signifies smooth, from the Saxon smed. An antiquarian friend has seen it designated in a deed as Campus Planus, which confirms the original meaning. It is described in Fitzstephen's account of London, written before the 12th century, as a plain field, both in reality and name, where "every Friday there is a celebrated rendezvous of fine horses brought hither to be sold. thither come to look or buy a great number of earls, barons, knights, and a swarm of citizens. It is a pleasing sight to behold the ambling nags and generous colts proudly prancing." This ancient writer continues a minute description, and perhaps gives the earliest one of a horse race in this country. It is remarkable that Smithfield should have continued as a market for cattle for more than 6 centuries, with only the change of its vowels. This is sufficient to show how the names of our streets require either to be corrected or explained by their historian. The French, among the numerous projects for the immoral improvement of civilized man, had one, which, had it not been polluted by a horrid faction, might have been directed to a noble end. It was to name streets after eminent men. This would at least preserve them from the corruption of the people, and exhibit a perpetual monument of moral feeling and of glory to the rising genius of every age. With what excitement and delight may the young contemplatist, who first studies at Gray's Inn, be reminded of Verulam buildings! The names of streets will often be found connected with some singular event, or the character of some person, and anecdotes of our streets might occupy an entertaining antiquary. Not long ago, a Hebrew, who had a quarrel with his community about the manner of celebrating the Jewish festival in commemoration of the fate of Haman, called Purim, built a neighborhood at Bethnal Green, and retained the subject of his anger in the name which the houses bear, of Purim Place. This may startle some theological antiquary at a remote period, who may idly lose himself in abstruse conjectures on the sanctity of a name derived from a well-known Hebrew festival, and perhaps, in his imagination, be induced to colonize the spot with an ancient horde of Israelites. End of Section 42. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 43 of Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jason in Panama. Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2, by Isaac Disraeli. Secret History of Edward Weir, Earl of Oxford. It is an odd circumstance in literary research that I am enabled to correct a story which was written about 1680. The Aubrey papers, recently published with singular faithfulness, retaining all their peculiarities, even to the grossest errors, was memoranda for the use of Anthony Wood's great work. But beside these, the Oxford antiquary had a very extensive literary correspondence, and it is known that when speechless and dying he evinced the fortitude to call in 2 friends to destroy a vast multitude of papers. About 2 bushels full were ordered for the fires lighted for the occasion, and, as he was expiring, he expressed both his knowledge and approbation of what was done, by throwing out his hands. These 2 bushels full were not, however, all his paper. His more private ones he had ordered not to be opened for 7 years. I suspect also that a great number of letters were not burnt on this occasion, for I have discovered a manuscript written about 1720 to 1730, and which, the writer tells us, consists of excerpts out of Anthony Wood's papers. It is closely written, and contains many curious facts not to be found elsewhere. These papers of Anthony Wood probably still exist in the Ashmolean Museum. Should they have perished, in that case this solitary manuscript would be the sole record of many interesting particulars. By these I correct a little story, which may be found in the Aubrey Papers, Volume 3, 395. It is an account of one Nicholas Hill, a man of great learning, and in the high confidence of a remarkable and munificent Earl of Oxford, travelling with him abroad. I transcribe the printed Aubrey account. In his travels with his lord, I forget whether Italy or Germany, but I think the former, A poor man begged him to give him a penny. "A penny," said Mr. Hill. "What dost say to £10?" "Ah, £10," said the beggar, "that would make a man happy." Mr. Hill gave him immediately £10, and put it down upon account. Item, to a beggar £10 to make him happy. The point of this story has been marred in the telling. It was drawn up from the following letter by Aubrey to A. Wood, dated July 15, 1689. A poor man asked Mr. Hill, his lordship's steward, once to give him sixpence or a shilling for an alms. "What dost say if I give thee £10?" £10, that would make a man of me. Hill gave it to him, and put down in his account £10 for making a man, which his lordship inquiring about for the oddness of the expression, not only allowed, but was pleased with it. This philosophical humourist was the steward of Edward Weir, Earl of Oxford, in the reign of Elizabeth. This peer was a person of elegant accomplishments, and Lord Orford, in his Noble Authors, has given a higher character of him than perhaps he may deserve. He was of the highest rank, in great favour with the Queen, and, in the style of the day, when all our fashions and our poetry were moulding themselves on the Italian model, he was the mirror of Tuscanismo. And, in a word, this coxcombical peer, after 7 years' residence in Florence, returned highly Italianated. The ludicrous motive of this peregrination is given in the present manuscript account. Haughty of his descent and alliance, irritable with effeminate delicacy and personal vanity, a little circumstance, almost too minute to be recorded, inflicted such an injury on his pride, that in his mind it required years of absence from the court of England ere it could be forgotten. Once making a low obeisance to the Queen before the whole court, this stately and inflated peer suffered a mischance, which has happened, it is said, on a like occasion. It was light as air, but this accident so sensibly hurt his mawkish delicacy, and so humbled his aristocratic dignity, that he could not raise his eyes on his royal mistress. He resolved from that day to be a banished man, and resided for 7 years in Italy, living in more grandeur at Florence than the Grand Duke of Tuscany. He spent in those years £40,000. On his return, he presented the Queen with embroidered gloves and perfumes, then for the first time introduced into England, as Stowe has noticed. Part of the new presents seemed to have some reference to the Earl's former mischance. The Queen received them graciously, and was even painted wearing those gloves. But my authority states that the masculine sense of Elizabeth could not abstain from congratulating the noble coxcomb, perceiving, she said, that at length my lord had forgot the mentioning the little mischance of 7 years ago. This peer's munificence abroad was indeed the talk of Europe, but the secret motive of this was as wicked as that of his travels had been ridiculous. This Earl of Oxford had married the daughter of Lord Burleigh, and when this great statesman would not consent to save the life of the Duke of Norfolk, the friend of this earl, he swore to revenge himself on the Countess, out of hatred to his father-in-law. He not only forsook her, but studied every means to waste that great inheritance which had descended to him from his ancestors. Secret history often startles us with unexpected discoveries. The personal affectations of this earl induced him to quit a court where he stood in the highest favour, to domesticate himself abroad, and a family pique was the secret motive of that splendid prodigality which, at Florence, could throw into shade the court of Tuscany itself. Section 43.